What is Scots? Scots is, as I said before, it's this wide, think of it as a continuum. And it's your classic, in linguistics, we talk about the Scots linguistic continuum. And at one end, you've got Scottish Standard English. And Scottish Standard English is, very simply put, English with a Scottish accent. That's probably how I'm sounding now. I've segged into my Scottish Standard English. And way at the other end of that continuum is fit we call Broad Scots, and now I've moved into my Broad Scots. And that differs fundamentally in sounds, structures, and words from English. So within that continuum, what you tend to find is you get folk at one end, folk at the other end, but a lot of folk can be both ends, and they can slide up and down that linguistic continuum, sounding mere Scottish Standard English or mere Broad Scots, just exactly as I've been doing now when I'm speaking.
This continuum is something that our Scots English bilinguals ken about, and its use is highly socially codified.
I hate it if you meet somebody that's English and somebody that's Scots, because I aince had two poets done well, twa Scots folk, Aberdonians at either side of us. One was Dr. Ken Morris, and he got to Robert Gordon's and was posh. And Robbie Shepherd was on the other side, and he got to Robert Gordon's, but he wasn't posh. And I just thought, because I didn't want Dr. Ken Morris thinking I was a gape, and I didn't want to Robbie Shepherd to think I was up myself, so I didn't say anything.
I'm fae Buckie. I'm actually nae quite fae Buckie. I'm fae the wee village outside Buckie. It's called Pertessie, but if you bide in Pertessie, nobody calls it Pertessie, you call it the Slough. Okay, so I'm for the Slough, and it's about, I think about 1,000 folk live in the Slough. And all my family live within about a half-mile radius of each other. They're all still up there. So I grew up in Buckie. I left when I was 18. My sister and brother were there till they were 18, or actually my sister was there until her 30s. So this is what we sounded like. And when I'm lecturing, I'm speaking like this in my more standard Scots voice. But when I go back to Buckie, I speak like this. And in fact, I could never go back speaking like this in my telephone voice, because people would be like, Fada vi thank ye are, the Queen or something. So I definitely do a big switch when I go back to Buckie, and I speak in my hame tongue.
Sheena Blackhall is one of the most important makers working in Scotland. Over the last umpteen years, she's worked through the reintroduction of North East Scots to the literary world, drawing upon both her own personal heritage and Scotland's literary heritage, including Burns, Charles Murray, J.C. Milne and Hugh MacDiarmid. What North East Scots actually is changes and evolves. Change certainly doesn't mean death, and in fact is the sign of a living tongue.
Charles Murray is probably the first major name poet from the northeast of Scotland, concentrating largely on local concerns of rural northeast Scotland. After the First World War, many writers and other artists across Scotland, perhaps aware that they'd been fighting a war for Belgium, a small country, began to develop the idea of a new Scottish Renaissance. The most famous player in this is, of course, Hugh MacDiarmid. Now, it's difficult to compare Hugh MacDiarmid with Charles Murray because they were trying to do different things. Also, perhaps one was more talented than the other. Nonetheless, one of the less attractive features of the Renaissance as perceived by Hugh MacDiarmid was that dialect poetry in any variety of Scots was considered to be backward-looking, conservative and anti-Scottish. So you get into the situation when a very fine writer of Scots, Alexander Scott, writing in the period during and after the Second World War, who came from the northeast of Scotland, didn't write Northeast Scots, had in fact mocking references possibly to his own speech. I would say, in fact, that until we get to an artist of the calibre of Sheena Blackhall, who is in a sense an inheritor of both Murray and MacDiarmid, can we actually talk about a Doric Renaissance poet?
When I was a bairn, I learned Doric from my grandmother, and she had been at New Deer, but prior to that she was at Migby. So my grandmother's Scots would have been a generation older than everybody else's, and given that my mother was 40 when I was born, and Granny was a fair age then, I'm speaking Doric that would have been used at the end, well, afore Queen Victoria did.
So 20 years ago, when I started doing this research, nobody used this term Doric. Folk in Buckie, that was an academic thing that posh folk down south used, right? And now it's almost been claimed. And when I go to Buckie now and talk to people, they're like, oh yeah, you see, I speak the Doric. And I'm like, so it's an interesting claiming of that word, but then people claim it in different ways, and what does it mean, etc. It's really interesting. Nobody used this term Doric 20 years ago. So and I think it's come from the media started talking about Doric, right? And it was picked up by locals rather than it starting ground up, it came top down. So when you look, if you take Doric to be a kind of big area in North East Scotland, your big isogloss, your big bubble covering quite a big part of the North East, and within that you've got huge differences. So if you compare Moray Firth Doric, like Buckie, the Broch, for example, to someone like Deeside, they sound radically different. And perhaps one of the big differences, Farman versus Fisher. And you see that within even my own community in Buckie. If you listen to the farmers just 2 or 3 miles inland versus the fisher folk for the coast, they sound different.
And there's been a lot more movement in the North East than folk think. So folk just didn't abide. Apart from my family, which never seemed to leave, they get up to Coolin for 1623 and just leave his bed there, never left. But that's unusual. Most folk are wandering about all over the place. And it does affect language, of course it affects language. And now, of course, it's in the TV, so you find that it's seen as cool if you're Glasgow spoken. And you'll hear bairns in your class for Shetland, you'll hear them for Glasgow. So if you're going to say to them, oh, I like your Scots, well, you can't expect mine, or that's, you know. There's perfectly legitimate to give that an airing as well.
We ken there's this thing that, and it's counterintuitive, but it's a fact, that language changes all the time. It's constantly moving tectonic plates all the time. There's no any language that stands still. So what we do in sociolinguistics is we compare generations of speakers. So your grannies, your mums and dads, and your parents, and we compare and contrast their speech. And when I've done that a lot in Buckie. You'll find, for example, that grannies will be saying fecht and racht and nacht, but the younger speakers, the bairns, will be saying fight and night and right.
It is always tempting with Scots to make up some kind of Jeremiad, that the next generation, who are of course a generation of vipers, are destroying our beautiful language by their watching YouTube and listening to popular music of one form or another. People have been saying that since the 18th century and it hasn't quite worked. I think we're at a crossroads with Scots today, which is that it will continue to be spoken, but by fewer and fewer people. Now, with the exception of the small dialects like the Black Isle, I won't see the end of any of the other dialects. But Scots, because it's a close relative of Standard English, is in the invidious position that gradually it can be subsumed into a colloquial form of English, and possibly we wouldn't notice all the time. Because the thing I notice going is not the pronunciation, and it's not necessarily the bits of grammar that we have different from English, it's the vocabulary. And without some kind of understanding of what's happening with that, which we don't really have as yet, we can't really see what's going to happen in the future for Scots.